Hi, it's Rob. Welcome to the next video in the AWS Amplify playlist. In the prior videos in the playlist, we implemented authentication using the Amplify Authenticator UI. In this video, we'll remove the Authenticator UI and implement authentication in our own web pages using the Amplify Auth API. To get started in this demo, I've created a new folder in my project named Contacts App v2, which I'll push up to my GitHub repo and link to in the description below. In this folder, I have the React files for my app. However, in its current state, there is no Amplify integration. So before we take a look at the code, let's jump into a terminal and launch an app and take a look at the navigation. Here we see when the app launches, the home page is displayed with links to login and register pages. There are also links in the nav bar. If I click register, we're presented with our registration form, and login, we're presented with the login form. Opening the JavaScript console in the developer tools, and then filling out the fields in the register form, when I click the register button, we see the user entered values in the console. And if I go to the login screen and complete this form and click login, we'll see the values here as well. Now, if you followed along in the other videos in the playlist, you'll know that there's a contacts route in this application, which when launched, will redirect the user to the contacts page. However, in this case, unless the user is authenticated, they're brought back to the home page. So now that we've seen the current routing implementation, let's jump back into VS Code and take a look at the code. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier video in the playlist where we scaffolded the React app, I mentioned the focus of this playlist is on Amplify and not React. So we'll just take a high-level look at the code here. But if you're looking for an actual course on React, I highly recommend the Udemy course, React, the Complete Guide, by Maximilian Schwarzmüller. And if you want a walkthrough of how this demo app was scaffolded, I'll put a link to the video in the playlist where we first created it using Create React App in the description below. Okay, now back to our code. Here, we're looking at the app.js file, which uses React state to initialize an isAuthenticated variable, setting its default value to false. Then further down, where we return the HTML to be rendered, we have our components listed, some of which are nested in a routes element. And as you can see, in the site nav component, and the routes for the home page and the contacts component, we're passing an isAuthenticated property, setting the value to the isAuthenticated variable in the React state. Now, jumping into the components folder, then the common folder, and opening the siteNav.js file, we see that in the siteNav function, we're passing props. Then further below, where we're creating the navbar elements, we're checking to see if the props property is authenticated is not equal to false. Then we'll create a nav link with the text logout, which when clicked calls the handle logout function, which right now just alerts the text logout. If the props is authenticated property is false, then we'll create nav elements that link to the login and register page. And if we jump back into the app.js file, we'll recall that isAuthenticated is set to false in the state. So when the site nav component is rendered, until the user is authenticated, we'll see the login and register buttons in the site's navbar. Jumping into the homepage component, we see we're also passing props, which in this case, we'll check to see if isAuthenticated is false, and if it is, we'll add links to the login and register pages on the home page. Else, if is authenticated is not false, we'll add a link to the contacts page. And in the contacts component, we also pass props, and we've implemented a React use effect hook, which checks the props is authenticated for not true, and if that's the case, it navigates back to the home page. So if the user isn't authenticated, we don't let them view the contacts page. Now, jumping into the auth folder inside of the components folder, we see we have a login page, a register page, and a validate page. Looking at the register page, we'll see that we're not passing props to this component. Here we have 3 variables declared: username, password, and email, which are defaulted to empty strings in the React state. Then if we scroll down inside of the form, we see elements for the username, the email, and the password. Each of these form elements has an onChange event, which passes the event into a function to set the value of the state for that variable. Also, there's a button to register, which has an onClick event handler, which calls the handle register function, which currently just writes the values from the state to the console. The login component is similar to the register component, but in this case, it just has variables for the username and password. Taking a look at the validate page component, we see there are variables for the username and authentication code. These are the values that we'll need to send to the Amplify Validation API, where the authentication code will be sent to the email address used in the registration process. And if you watched the prior videos in the playlist, you'll recall the Amplify Authenticator UI validation dialog looks like this. However, in our app, our validation component will call the Amplify Auth API. Now, with a walkthrough of the current code complete, we can move on to integrating Amplify. To get started, I've created an IAM user with administrator access for the demo and configured that user on my local machine. Now, I'll execute Amplify configure to configure Amplify. I'll create an IAM user named Amplify Cloud User, attach the administrator access Amplify policy, and create the user. Then I'll open the user, go into security credentials, scroll down to access keys, and create an access key. Now I'll copy the access key, jump back in the terminal, hit enter, paste in the key, and do the same for the secret access key. I'll enter Amplify Cloud User for the profile name, and now my Amplify Cloud User has been configured. Next, in my project's root folder, I'll enter Amplify init to initialize the Amplify project. I'll give the project a name of AWS Amplify Demo and say yes to confirm the project information. I'll use an AWS profile for the Amplify Cloud user. And now if we jump into the AWS Amplify console, we see our AWS Amplify demo app. And in VS Code, we see an AWS exports.js file, which will be managed by Amplify. Now, back in the terminal, I'll execute an Amplify add auth to add authentication to our project. I'll use a default configuration and allow users to sign in using a username. And then select No, I am done. Then I'll push my changes up to Amplify. And now if we jump into the Amazon Cognito console, we see a user pool for our Amplify application. Now, back in the terminal, as I did in the prior videos in this playlist, I'll execute Amplify add storage to add storage to our project. The content type will be images, audio, video, etc. And I'll give the resource a name of contact storage and a bucket name of contact storage. The authentication will be for auth users only, and I'll grant create, update, and read privileges. And then say no to add a Lambda trigger for the S3 bucket. Then push the changes to Amplify. And now if we jump into the S3 console, we see our contact storage bucket. Then finally, back in the terminal, I'll execute an Amplify add API to add an API to our project. It'll be a GraphQL API, and I'll give it a name of Contact API, then continue, select single object with fields, and then say yes to edit the schema now. Here in the schema, I'll change the name of the model from to-do to contact and include properties for the ID, name, email, cell, and the profile pic path, as I did in the prior videos in the playlist. Then save the file. Then, to save time in the video, I executed an Amplify push to push the GraphQL changes to Amplify. Now, we could jump into the DynamoDB console, and we see our contacts table. Now, with our Amplify backend configured with an API, auth, and storage, we can turn our attention back to the code and implement our custom authentication pages for register, validate, and login. Looking at the package.json file in the project, you'll see I've already added the dependencies needed for the app. So, since I already ran npm install, I'm all set to move forward with the code changes. And we'll start in the app.js file. To get started, I'll add imports for Amplify and the AWS exports file. And then pass AW exports to the configure method on the Amplify object. Next, in the register page component, I'll import auth from AWS Amplify, and then modify the handle register function, making it an asynchronous function which calls the signup method on the auth object, passing it the username, password, and email address the user entered into the form. And for now, we'll just log the user to the console. In the validate page component, I'll also import auth from Amplify, then modify the handle registration confirmation function to be an asynchronous function which calls the confirm signup method on the auth object, passing the username and authentication code sent to the email used during the registration process. And for now, just log a success message to the console. Now, with these changes made, if I jump into a terminal and launch the app, then go to the register page and fill out the form, then click register. In the JavaScript console, we see the data that we sent in our registration API request, as well as the response that came back. And now if we jump into the Cognito user pool in the console and refresh, we'll see our foobar user has been added, but the confirmation status is unconfirmed. So what we need to do now is jump into our email and grab the confirmation code. Then I'll go to the validate route, enter the username, and paste in the authentication code, and then validate. And here in the JavaScript console, we see the data that we passed to the validation API, and the result was successful. So now if we jump back into Cognito and refresh, we see our user has now been confirmed. Now moving to the login page component, again, I'll import auth and then modify the handle login function to be an asynchronous function which calls the sign-in method on the auth object, passing the username and password. Now I'll save the file, jump back into the browser, go to the login page, enter the username and password, then click login, and we see our login was successful. Now it looks like we're in a pretty good place with our app and the Amplify integration. However, we need to modify our React code a bit to handle the navigation between our page components. So when a user successfully registers, they're taken to the validation page. Then on successful validation, they're taken to the login page. And of course, on successful login, they're redirected to the contacts page. And on the contacts page, the login and register links in the nav bar will be replaced with a logout link, which will call the auth object's signout API to log the user out of the app, then redirect them to the home page. So to get started, I'll jump into the register page and import use navigate as well as link from React Router DOM. Then in the register page function, I'll instantiate an instance of a use navigate object. Then I'll replace the console.log statement with a navigate method call, passing it the route to the validate page. Now, moving to the validate page, I'll also import use navigate, instantiate an instance of the object, and then on successful validation, navigate to the login page. And finally, in the login page, again, I'll import use navigate, instantiate an instance of the object, and then on successful login, navigate to the contacts route. However, if we go back to the app.js file, you'll recall in our contacts route, we're passing the isAuthenticated property, passing the value of the isAuthenticated variable. So before I can navigate to the contacts page after a successful login, I need to update the value of the isAuthenticated variable to true. And to do this, I'll create a function named updateAuthStatus, passing in the new value of authStatus, and then passing that to the setIsAuthenticated method. Then down in the login route, I'll pass the function in as props, which in the login component, I can then call passing the value of true. Now, with the code deployed and ready to test, I'm going to jump back into Cognito and delete our existing user. And now I could jump back into our app and test the authentication flow. I'll start out by going to the register page, filling out the form, and clicking the register button. Now I'm redirected to the validate page where I could populate the username and the authentication code from my email. Now I'll click validate and then enter my username and password, click login, and I'm redirected to the contacts page with the links in the nav bar updated to a logout link, which if I click, right now I just get an alert with the text of logout. So what I want to do is jump back into VS Code and implement the logout functionality using the Amplify Auth API. In the site nav component, I've imported use navigate from React Router DOM and auth from Amplify. Then I've instantiated an instance of the navigate object and modified the handle logout function to be an asynchronous function call, which calls the signout method on the auth object. Then I'm calling the update status method on props, passing it false before navigating to the home page. And in order to call update auth status on props back in app.js, I've also passed the updated auth status function as a prop in the site nav component. Now, with the file saved and deployed, if we go back to the browser, I'll refresh the page, then log in again. And now when I click logout, I'm redirected back to the home page. And if I try and access the contacts route, I'm redirected to the home page again. So that completes the implementation of Amplify Auth in our custom HTML pages. Since this video focused specifically on the auth implementation, I won't cover the code for adding contacts on the contacts page. If you'd like a walkthrough of that functionality, feel free to watch the prior video in the playlist. As always, if you found this video helpful, feel free to give it a like. And if you'd like to be notified when I add more content to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.